If I could have your attention, the time is 5:30. If we could ask everyone to take a seat, and we'll get started in just a minute or two. Thank you. David? Jim, how are you?
Yeah. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting of the Bloomington City Council Committee of the Whole to order, please. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Alderman Black.
Here.
Alderman Fazzini.
Here.
Alderman Fruin.
Here.
Alderman Lauer.
Here.
Alderman Sage.
Here.
Alderman Milwamway.
Here.
Alderman Stern.
Here.
Alderman Painter.
Here.
Alderman Schmidt.
Here.
Mayor Renner.
Here. Do we have public comment cards? Is anyone? Nobody turned in any. Okay. All right. So we will move right along to our Committee of the Whole minutes from May 19th and July 21st, 2014. Can I have a motion to approve these minutes as presented?
I'll make that motion. Second.
Moved by Alderwoman Schmidt and second by Alderwoman Painter. Any discussion, corrections? And we're going to go ahead and vote on this electronically. Should be okay. Alderman Milwamboy, oh, you have voted too. Okay, sorry. We have 9 ayes and no nays to report, Madam Clerk. Thank you. And we move right along to our discussion item of the evening, priority-driven, priority-based budgeting. And we're certainly very happy to have Mr. Bernie Saraki and others this evening. Bernie had contacted me many months ago. We met and he offered us essentially lots of expert talent, and the cost was perfect. It was free. And so when we can get expertise and outside consultants to really help sharpen our analytical abilities and our focus and improve our operations in our city, we are absolutely thrilled. And Bernie, I've just been very, very pleased with how you've worked with me and Alderman Sage. And Alderman Sage, thank you too for taking the lead on this and making sure that all this has happened. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Mr. Hales, our city manager.
Mayor, thank you very much. In addition to Bernie Saraki, who we'll hear from in just a minute, we also have from the IIT Stewart School of Business, David Ehrlich, PhD, visiting assistant professor. And the person who's come the farthest to speak to us tonight is Rick Hoppy, who is assistant to the mayor in Lincoln, Nebraska. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read his article that appeared just this month, I think, in the GFOA Government Finance Review. Do want the council to know that prior to this meeting, we had a pre-meeting We took advantage, brought in all the senior leadership team and others to have kind of about an hour discussion, a lot of questions just for everyone, at the staff level to get a better understanding of priority-based budgeting and the experience of Lincoln, Nebraska. So over the last 5 years and utilizing this new methodology. That was extremely helpful, but I think we very much appreciate Rick coming from Lincoln, and I know he's got other issues going on and priorities, but for him to take time out of his busy schedule to join us tonight, we really appreciate. I think I can speak for all the staff. We certainly are very excited about the possibility of trying something new and different than we have in the past. And our intent tonight, as you saw in the staff backup report, is to help the entire council get a better, higher level understanding of what is priority-based budgeting, how has it been used successfully, especially in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then also from Mr. Siraki, what role would IIT play in helping the council, the staff, the community through this type of process. All we're looking tonight at the end of all the discussion is just to see if the council wants to take that next step of having Mr. Siraki and the university put together something in much more detail as to what the process timeline would be, time commitments, things of that nature. So again, this is kind of a preview, an introduction, it's kind of for the entire council to get a better understanding with a very specific and successful case study out of Lincoln, Nebraska, where they've used this for the last 5, 6, 7 years. So with that, I'd like to turn to Bernie Siraki to come forward and begin tonight's discussion, presentation, and then discussion with the council. Bernie.
Welcome, Bernie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Let me give you just a little background of how this came about and who I am and what the Stewart School of Business at IIT is. I was a lobbyist for almost 40 years in Springfield, in the Midwest, and in Washington. And along the way, I picked up a PhD and decided if I'm ever going to teach, I better do it before I got too old. And so a couple of years ago, I gave up my lobby practice and began teaching full-time. About a year ago, I had a discussion with the dean at the Stewart School of Business, and I said, what we really need in this state is not another think tank that does policy, but a think tank that approaches management problems that cities and the state have. And he said, write it up. To make a long story short, I did. To make a long story shorter, even shorter, it was approved, funded, and in March we started something called the Stewart Center for Applied Public Management. And initially what I would like to do with and he said to me, would you be director? And I said yes. The Stewart School is part of IIT. It is in Chicago, downtown, and it is also on 35th Street at the IIT main campus. We have three basically sections of the Stewart School of Business: the Environmental Management section, the MBA section, Masters in Business Administration, and a Masters in Public Administration, the MPA section. And we wanted to combine the expertise that we have in the faculty in those three sections of the school and use them in the Center for Applied Public Management. I wanted to go and approach mid-level cities as my first choice, and I wanted to avoid Chicago. So I went to Peoria, Illinois, and I went to Bloomington. I, by the way, live in Springfield, still live in Springfield, and I actually commute to Chicago and stay there a couple days a week. And I went to Bloomington and Peoria because I was familiar with those cities, but they're also the perfect size for what I was looking for to initially start this center off. In Peoria, we're doing a combined sewer overflow project, which seems like every city in Illinois is facing. And I went and I met with the mayor here at Bloomington, and we talked, and we then brought in David Sage and Karen and David Hales, and we decided that, or they decided that they'd like me to take a look at priority or results-based, or whatever you want to call it, budgeting. It is a method of budgeting that differs and has been around for about 15 years. It differs from the traditional form of budgeting where you say, well, what did we spend last year? Let's raise it by 12% and cover inflation and just keep on going. It actually is a way of measuring, it is a method of measuring the efficacy and the effectiveness, or the efficiency rather, of programs within a city budget. It's the new reality. And it has been tried by some cities, and that's what intrigued me about it, because some cities have not been successful. Some cities have had it for 1 year and don't even do it anymore. And other cities, basically Lincoln, and particularly Lincoln, Nebraska, has got a sustainable methodology. I talked to Lincoln. I talked to the University of Nebraska, who works hand in hand with Lincoln, Nebraska. They asked me if I would collaborate if we do something in Bloomington. Would I share the information with them? And I said, sure, share your methodology with us so we can take a look at it and change it. And so we have a working relationship, I think, with the University of Nebraska. So if this project goes forward, I think that we'll be collaborating on it every step of the way. I think the best way to talk about Lincoln is to have someone from Lincoln tell you what they did and how they've done it since 2008, because it's been sustainable. It's been something that they can turn to every year. They've avoided the pitfalls. They've got a program in Lincoln that is the methodology is sound, but it's not so heavy, it's not so esoteric that it falls apart. They have a fairly simple approach to things and have done a heck of a job. And so I'm going to introduce Rick Hoppy. He's assistant to the mayor of Lincoln, and Rick will talk, and we can answer any questions that you may have. Our role at Stewart School of Business in this project will be exactly what the University of Nebraska did with Lincoln. So, Rick?
Good evening, Mayor, Alderman. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here
Welcome.
tonight. If your community is half as good as the drive from the airport to here, you guys must be doing okay, because I was really impressed so far. I was hoping to show you a little bit of a slideshow that was developed for something else, but hopefully this will help you understand a little better what we did. And please forgive me, I'm going to skip a few slides in the interest of time here, and I hope Alderman Sage will get the big hook out if I go past my 15 minutes. Okay? Let's see here. Okay, that is my boss, Mayor Chris Beitler. And he asked rightfully, why would somebody get us into this? I'm the chief of staff to the mayor and have been for the 7 years he's been in office. And when we first started talking about the notion of outcome-based budgeting and public participation budgeting, there was quite a few skeptical people like the mayor is here. Well, the reason you do something like this is what we found out through the University of Nebraska Public Policy Center. You can greatly increase public trust and confidence in the decisions that you make by engaging with your public in a decision-making framework which they can replicate. Now, I'm going to say that again, a decision-making framework in which they can replicate, because that's what builds trust and confidence, when they can see what you're doing in a very transparent way and look at the same information that you've looked at and come to similar conclusions. Well, I need to take you back in just a little bit of history here, and I'll do it real quickly. The city of Lincoln was facing a number of challenges that all communities have faced over the years, particularly in relationship to the recession. Our property tax and our sales tax were about 70% of our revenues, and at one point in 2008, they were both going backwards after the national housing collapse. In fact, our sales tax wasn't doing very well. Our labor costs were going up. Nebraska has a unique way of determining public sector salaries. We do it by comparing them to other jurisdictions, even those that are outside the state of Nebraska. So we don't have a lot of control over our labor costs. And so you have one trend going this way, another trend going this way, and a budget that was never balanced the way it should have been. And the real problem was we didn't have any community consensus on how to deal with the issue. Nobody wanted to cut anything, and nobody wanted to raise taxes. In fact, when we'd come into office, it had been 14 years since the property tax levy had been raised. So what you had was a lot of stopgap solutions. and we were guilty of this too. We put in one-time monies. We stopped funding capital budgets. We tried every gimmick we could think of to try to avoid the awful truth in dealing with the problem. And this is just a slide that kind of gives you a little detail on what we were facing in the 3-year period when we really implemented this. You can see on the left that our cost per FTE went up 12% over that 3-year period. The consumer price index was 5%, and our sales and property tax was lagging well behind that. So we had a real serious situation on our hands. Fortunately, however, I don't sleep very often, and I checked out a book from our public library off the shelf called The Price of Government. A couple of policy wonks named David Osborne and Peter Hutchinson, who made their reputations in the Clinton administration with that effort to reinvent government. They reformed bureaucracy in a number of places. And they had kind of an interesting conception of what this all should add up and be. And they were advocates of outcome-based budgeting, okay? And you heard a little bit from Bernie about what the traditional means of doing a budget is. Okay, you take a look at what you did last year, you add inflation to it, then you see the god-awful truth about your revenues, and you realize that you have to come in at 95% of what you did the previous year. Well, their belief was that was the wrong way to go about it, because then the budget was driving the process rather than what you wanted to accomplish. So they say the results of what that system does is that it still promotes programs that don't deliver. You have a staff that's overworked and lacks in focus. You don't do future planning. And most importantly, you really only delay the inevitable. And their whole point was there's a better system for dealing with this that better ties your spending decisions to a framework that's rooted in some research-based results. Okay? So we started down this path by implementing outcome-based budgeting. We implemented performance standards, and the most important piece to all, we got together with our university's Public Policy Center to engage the community so that we could try to make this stick and develop that consensus we need to make the changes that needed to happen in the city of Lincoln. This is kind of some boring background stuff, but the premise of this whole thing is that your budget choices need to be grounded in what you want to accomplish, and that seems self-evident, but when you're getting down to the details of the budget, you sometimes lose sight of that. The other piece that's really important in this whole process is to make sure that you have some indicator or performance measures in place so that you can evaluate how well you're reaching your goals and the things that you want to accomplish. Okay? In the city of Lincoln, we now have what we call 8 budget outcomes, and you can see them listed here. They're pretty self-evident except for Identity Lincoln. Those are the things that are special about Lincoln that we fund. Every community has a veterans plaza or a really great park that you use, and that tends to fall in that category. The point I want to make on this slide, however, is that I got together with our staff at a favorite pizza joint in Lincoln, Nebraska, and we hammered out the 8 things that we think we were doing as a community, and we put them down. Then, using the Public Policy Center's research methodology, we conducted a scientific poll of the citizens of the community, and they rank ordered these budget outcomes for us. So you can see moving across the top, safety and security was the most important, followed by economic opportunity, with Identity Lincoln coming in last place primarily because people didn't know exactly what we meant. But that was the first step for us, was establishing those budget outcomes and then having the community help us rank order them in a fashion that made sense to them. Then within each budget outcome, I got the staff back together, but we also this time brought in people from the private and nonprofit sector to help us develop the goals for each outcome area. The idea was to have them say, look, what is it we should be trying to accomplish to meet the goal of being a safe and secure community? As you can see from the slide here, we adopted 5 goals in that particular area, and almost every outcome we had 4 to 6 different goals. We also prioritized the order of those goals as well. So maintain a low crime rate was our number 1 goal in safety and security, and you might see some interesting things on here that we'll talk about in some more detail, but I'd call your attention to youth activity, which sometimes isn't regarded as necessarily something you would consider under safety and security, but this is one of the things that outcome-based budgeting makes you think about, is what non-traditional activities are actually having impact on your performance measures. Now, this is just a little diagram that shows a little bit about how we look at these sort of things. So under safety and security, the second goal is timely and effective incident management. And these are a handful of the performance indicators that we use to determine how well we're doing on the goal of timely and effective incident management. Now, one thing to notice on the slide right off the bat is it's not limited to one department. A couple of these are about snow removal that come out of our Public Works Department. The one on the far left about advanced life support is from our Lincoln Fire and Rescue, our fire department. So the first thing to take out of this is one of the great things about outcome-based budgeting is it does break down some of the silos between departments and gets people working together to try to have maximum impact on the indicators that show success or lack of success. And you'll note right there, we try to take the bad with the good. We're not meeting our response time for first advanced life support, and we still have some work to do on that particular indicator. That's kind of a response to that. Well, I think we'll skip that for now. So then where this all kind of starts to shake itself out is after we identified those outcomes, then we had goals associated with each outcome, we did the hardest part of all. And it seems kind of counterintuitive that this should be the easiest part. But we sat down and we listed every single program that the city of Lincoln engaged. Okay? That takes more effort than you would ever imagine because as budgets get cut over the years and people assume multiple jobs that formerly were done by several people, programs become amalgamated and it becomes difficult to sort all those things out. But it's a hugely important step in what we did. It took us about 6 weeks of people working very hard to get those programs divided. And then what we did with all the programs is we gave them 3 things. We divided them into outcome areas, we associated them each with a goal, and then we tiered them. Now, the thinking behind the tiering was, and we tiered things into Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, with Tier 1 meaning that the program was most important to achieving that outcome goal, Tier 3 less so important, okay? The reason we did that is outcome-based budgeting does have kind of a perverse ending if you don't account for it, which is, you heard me say that safety and security is our number 1 goal, as it probably is in the vast majority of communities. But the question is, do you completely fund everything in safety and security before you get to the next outcome? We didn't see the logic in completely funding safety and security, even the low-end programs, before we got to other outcome areas. The tiering allowed us to do that. Okay? So for instance, if you have a Tier 1 program in livable neighborhoods or a Tier 1 program in healthy and productive people, that actually in our prioritization leads that program to be higher than even a Tier 3 program in public safety, which is our number 1 outcome. So if you take a look at this chart here, what you can see here is every program ends up with kind of a priority number. And this is kind of the low end of our prioritization. You can see that we were providing some financial support to municipal band summer concerts at one point, and that was a Tier 3 program in the Identity Lincoln outcome. That's why it's got the 8 beside it, although it was in our first goal about developing city culture. So right now, that's at the bottom of the list. So what happens around budget time, or at least before budget time, is we take out the community this list, and I'm going to show you the website that we do this here in a minute. And then we draw a great big red line through this prioritization that shows where we're short, and what would go below the line are the things that we would cut, and what we keep above the line are the things that we would maintain. And you'll note there that we list in this prioritization things that have been cut in previous years, so people have some sense of the follow-through that has happened. Now, if I can get out of this, I can show you exactly what we do here. All right. Okay, this is actually the website at the City of Lincoln. This is our Taking Charge website that invites community citizens to get together and take a look at our programming. And you can see here that all 206 programs are listed. You see here, for instance, that library hours on a Saturday is a $455,000 expenditure out of our general fund. It's a Tier 2 program. It's in our number 6 outcome, and it's in our number 5 goal. So obviously, it's a little more important than the ones you move down the list where they're Tier 3 programs or from a lower outcome. But the idea here is not only to give a sense of prioritization, but to connect all these things with performance measures, okay? So for instance, I want to make sure I find a good one here that's a little easier to digest. Safety and security is always easy. Okay, so for instance, right here on traffic direction and control, which is a $213,000 expenditure, we have tied that to some performance indicators that we review periodically to see how well we're doing on traffic safety. And you see right here that our goal is to maintain an injury traffic crash rate of no more than 850 crashes per 100,000 residents. And this red line represents that's what our goal is, and you can see here how well we've done towards that end. That's one of the measurements that we use to try to determine, is that program working well? Should we be doing something different? Should we be looking at a different department? Are there other places we can go to make some progress on that particular indicator? Okay. So let me talk for a minute about what this led to in terms of public engagement. We basically have 3 tools, actually 4 tools that we use. We do telephone and online surveys for the general public based on what I just showed you, okay? When we get towards the end of a budget, those things that might fall below the line, we take out to the public through the Public Policy Center, and we ask for citizen input, both through a telephone survey and an online survey. These are the items that we have out and we're considering cutting or funding. It's up to you to tell us and give us some direction on what you want to see here. Are you willing to pay for more money for these services? Here are the facts. Here are the performance indicators. Here's what the results will be if this program goes away or if we put more money into it. So we typically now do what we call forced choice budget items, okay? And this is from an engagement we did in 2009, and that's our public safety director talking to a deliberative discussion we had. So we had our online survey, about 1,800 people participated, and we gave them a list of the choices you see right there: non-injury track accidents, snow removal, school resource officers, and libraries, and asked them for their input on whether we keep these or what and we equated it with the amount of money that it would require to save the program. So we asked people, look, are you willing to pay this much more in taxes to do this, or is this program going away? And this is a good example of the kind of things, the discussion, the high-level discussion that results from this kind of thing. This is about snow removal, and it was listed in the article a little bit. But I would imagine this city isn't any different than mine, that when it begins to snow, if you judged your budget on the phone calls that came into your mayor's office, I'd have every single employee we had out with brooms in the street sweeping off snow before it fell. I'm sure you're not any different. I'm sure you get some pretty good winners here. But when you put it in terms of performance indicators and what the actual amounts that we spend on things, citizens' input tends to change. And as this demonstrated from one of the questions we had, people were willing to let more snow pile up when they had all the information put together on performance indicators and what that all meant. So where this ultimately evolved is the Public Policy Center developed a website for us that allowed people to take the 10 or 11 things that we were looking at the end of a budget cycle that might not make the budget. We would give them an amount of money to expend on these items, and and they would cost far more than the amount we would actually give them to spend. And that's an important thing to do here, because that's how you determine value. And people then had some choices. They could choose to spend the $750,000 and cut the rest of the programs. They could choose to raise taxes to save programs, or they could choose to cut everything and give themselves a tax reduction. And this is one of the screens that comes up when they did this that showed people the actual change in their property taxes. Not in their levy, but actually what they'd pay in taxes. You can see this person selected $760,000 of the programs, which would have cost them another 10 cents a year in property taxes. Okay, Mayor Byler is an impatient man. He wants me to get moving here. And hey, what happened with all this? Well, I'll tell you what happened. A couple of things that hadn't happened in a long time. We made choices. Okay, for the first time, we were starting to make choices. A good example is you'll see under 2010-11, we have what we call police middle school resource officers, which I understand Bloomington has as well. Well, we took a long, hard look. In the past, those never would have been cut because they were very political in outlook. But when we started to do this process and educate citizens about the fact that really these were not contributing to a reduction in the crime rate, i.e. they weren't meeting anything in our performance measures, that really was that a program we wanted to continue vis-a-vis other programs that were actually meeting and helping us meet our performance measures. Well, we were able to cut that program. And you can see a list of some other things here, like a senior center and some other places that I can tell you in the past would have been they've been sacred cows that we never would have been able to cut. As a result of doing some of this, we ended up reducing our civilian workforce by about 10%. But rather than doing it with a chainsaw, we were able to do it with a scalpel. We were able to pick programs that we felt like were not performing well or that did not meet the goals of the community and take those out, as opposed to across-the-board cuts, which many times take the good with the bad. Okay, so jumping to the real piece here that really is something to consider. The 11-12 budget is where it really it was really a crisis for us. We had about $145 million or $140 million general fund at that point, and we were $9 million in the hole. Okay, I told you that we had committed some sins here too, and we used one-time money as we started to get this started. Well, that was the year we put out the survey and listed all the items I showed you earlier and said to people, this is the situation. Here are the programs that are going away, and here's the reason why. We put out the performance indicators, we put out the data, we put out the list and said, now the ball is in your court. We can choose to save these programs by raising taxes, or we can cut them, but we cannot continue the route we're going. The citizens that took that survey, and there were about 2,700 of them, 84% of them said, yes, you need to raise the property tax levy to some degree to save at least some of these programs. Now, they were discriminating. This wasn't a bunch of folks that were so interested in government that they didn't make choices. Nobody said save everything. They had certain pieces they wanted to. Long story short, we ended up enacting a 10% increase in our property tax levy. We implemented a surcharge on our Lincoln electric system bills of about $6 million and instituted new wheel tax dollars, about 15%. Wheel tax, a charge we put on your car to try to deal with our road situation. That was an extensive increase in taxes, to say the least. But probably what was most surprising about the whole thing is what happened next. Not much. Yes, people don't like to have their taxes raised. People also support programs, and they don't want those to be cut. But for the amount of things that we did here, the outcry was very small. And the reason was we had involved the public in the decision-making process. We had carefully laid out the decision-making process that we used and asked them to replicate it and tell us what they wanted us to do. So, kind of a wrap-up for all the things that I've talked about. And I realize I've gone pretty quickly here, but I was sworn to try to keep this to 15 minutes. A few things that we've learned along the way. We literally have made cuts that people have told us to make. So if you don't want to know the answer, don't ask the question. To give you an example, at one point, citizens told us 2 years running that they no longer cared if we went ahead and took accident reports on public property in the case that people get into an accident. It was sucking up about 2 officers' worth of calls each year. So we said, okay, if you all think we shouldn't do this, we cut it. Now, at the end of the day, the council put it back, but then started charging a fee. But it's an example of the public seeing that you're following through with their recommendations and their choices. They're involved in the actual decisions, and that's the second point. It needs to be real. If you give public the actual choices on this, they'll surprise you with the choices that they do end up making. It's important to keep things simple. Part of the reason for outcome-based budgeting was to get a different mindset at City Hall in terms of getting those performance indicators in place, making sure people were making decisions that were driven by what we wanted to accomplish. But on the public piece of it, the reason that we chose such simple terms like safety and security, economic opportunity, was that we wanted to make it as simple as possible for the public to be engaged in this. You know, they only think about government and politics about 5 minutes a week, the average citizen, and we're probably competing for the 1 minute the president and Congress aren't getting. So we've got to make it very clear, very simple, and get in and out very quickly. That's why in our surveys, we typically don't ask them to engage in more than 8 or 9 items so they can keep track of those things, and why we've tried to make it as simple as possible for them to follow the process. Finally, involving a respected, unbiased partner is important. You're very fortunate to have the resources you have. The University of Nebraska has been absolutely a great thing for us. They've given us legitimacy. A lot of radio commentators would have just written this off as a political stunt had it not been for the involvement of the University of Nebraska and the legitimacy they brought to the process that we put together. And finally, the one thing I'd say to you all, it's all in how you frame the question. We really prefer this process because when you have a great big open town hall, those are great. It's good to hear what people are thinking, but many times they want you to do things that they don't understand you can't do because some other level of government's in charge or because there's something else, a mandate or something that you can't get around. So what we really like about this is we ask realistic questions about what we're willing to do, and that's why it works for us. So I've ran through this as fast as I can. I hope, Alderman, I haven't hit my time mark too close here. Do you have any questions or any thoughts that you'd like to?
Questions from members of the council? When do we start? Alderwoman Schmidt, we'll start with you.
Okay, so I'll start. I have a couple questions about input, the inputs. So, for example, you want to clear all of your residential streets in 50 hours or something. Where did that come from? Who set that as a goal, and how do you know if that's a good goal or not?
That's part of the experience. I mean, we started with this with citizens and directors coming together and just trying to give some idea of what to measure. So we took a look at past logs that the Public Works Department had been putting together and said, what is a reasonable target for us to get this done 100% of the time? And that's how we chose those. Now, I will say that our indicators have adjusted over the years, and this one's a good example. This used to be higher, but we started beating it so consistently, it didn't seem like a good idea to continue to lead the indicator at that point. So that's one thing I would tell you right up front, that your indicators will change as you make progress and as you find out that really this wasn't a great indicator. And I will tell you that you use the word input, which I'm guessing is kind of a code word in my world about, look, there's measuring progress and there's measuring inputs, okay? The number of reports you file in a day is an input. This one right here is more a performance measure. We still measure inputs because it does have some relevance to how people are performing their jobs, but we try to make them more like this one, where they're a goal associated with hard data.
I'm using the term input, I guess, to indicate where did you get that figure from? Is that a staff-driven figure, or is
Yes,
it
that
informed by
particular one
citizens?
was, but some of the other ones, in fact, on our website, if you're all interested, each one of these talks about where the data was drawn. So for this one, you can see that the accident investigation reports by the police department and some of the data taken from our State Department of Roads.
Okay.
So we get data from a number of different places.
Okay, and then a second question I have, I've heard a lot about the staff, I've heard a lot about the citizens. I didn't hear you really talk about the engagement of the city council. So could you just talk about how
This
that
is where I've got to
flows, at
come
least?
clean then, I guess. This was an administrative-driven piece for the first 5 years. Council, I'll be very honest with you, was suspicious of our motives. It was a change in doing business. They weren't comfortable with it because at times it forced them to make tough choices that weren't really great political choices. And we struggled with getting council on board for the first few years. Now in about year 5 and 6, I have a much stronger foothold in the council, and they're starting to participate in this process much more readily. They're starting to use the terminology much more. They're starting to work within the system. There's still a couple that really don't believe in it, and that's fine. I mean, I can't convince everyone of everything, as I'm sure you all face that reality every day.
Other questions? Alderman Pizzini.
In 2007, your incomes were decreasing and your expenses were increasing. We're looking at about a $400 million deficit because of deferred maintenance and underfunded pensions. Were you looking at anything of that depth?
That's a difficult question. We're about $7 million a year short on roads. Our pension's at about 72%. We just do police and fire. We don't have a defined benefit on the rest of them. So no, it wasn't approaching $400 million, but if you take everything into consideration, we were probably in the neighborhood of $100 million. And I don't want to mislead you, Alderman. We haven't figured all of this out yet.
Alderman Lauer, and then Sage.
I was very interested in how you dissect and deal with upper-level government mandates and how you work through the program when dealing with those, yes.
Great question, because Bernie said we didn't have any pitfalls. Well, this was a gigantic one, but eventually we figured it out. Let's see if I can bring this back up here just one moment. I told you about the tiering that we had earlier, 1, 2, and 3. Well, a lot of the mandated stuff wasn't really all that important to us. I mean, the reason we did it wasn't because we were accomplishing something. It was because someone told us we had to do it. I'm having trouble making this come up. So a lot of times citizens would take a look at our prioritization and they'd see Tier 3 programs and say, well, I'm having trouble getting this back up, but I can explain it. Well, I want to cut this. Why can't you cut this? Well, because it's mandated. Well, that was very frustrating to citizens to put it in order like that and then say, just kidding, can't really cut it. So we developed what we called a Tier 0 the third year. And so now all the programs that are mandated by the state and the feds have a 0 as their tier. So they're at the very top of this. And we've ended the confusion about what can be cut and what can't be cut. Because if you're Tier 0, we can't cut any of it. The state and feds have mandated that we have to provide that service.
Alderman Sage.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up on what Kevin asked, because I know a lot of the conversations I have with our residents are at the root of them are the unfunded mandates. And so there's value in being able to communicate. And for instance, our water bill we have all kinds of federal and state EPA mandates around, runoff and those types of
Mhm.
things. To folks who don't look at those all the time, they just see an increasing charge from the city of Bloomington. So I guess question one is, did you, how was that received by the folks in Lincoln when you began to clearly delineate and show them all of the unfunded federal and state mandates? How did they react?
It really helped. I mean, I think most people are reasonable, and we're all fortunate to be from the Midwest, where I think people are very practical in nature. And they were, I would say they appreciated the fact they were being educated instead of just being told, no, we can't do this. And now I'm finally going to be able to show this to you, I hope, here. So they received it very well, and it really did help. And here's an example, okay, of the Tier 0 stuff. If there's a state law saying we have to do it, like fire prevention inspections are required by the state, it gets a Tier 0. You can't cut it.
So you lead with those at the beginning of every
Yes, this
every
thing is in
budget.
complete priority order, and the Tier 0 are first, and it makes it much clearer to people in this list that you can't, that's at the top.
How did you, I guess, approach or manage? Because to some folks, the methodology, and I know Bernie will talk about this at some other point in the future, but how were you able to account? How did you emphasize? How did you communicate so that the process was crystal clear and transparent? So let me give you an example. For when it was time to choose who the folks were that were going to be called as part of your phone survey, and I don't think we're looking at a phone survey necessarily,
Right.
but did you just have something as simple as, here's a list and we chose every seventh person or something like that? I mean, how were you able to explain or account for the transparency around the process?
Well, we try to list all our methodology when we do these things. For instance, there's a tab here that's changes, where every year when we put something up, we explain what we did. And that's really important in this process. To answer your question more specifically on the polling, we let the Public Policy Center have that. But they did random sampling surveys. So we would gather a list from the election commissioner, for instance, that had phone numbers, and they'd randomly use a computer program to pull X number of people out of it and develop a pool to get their 600 surveys. I should say to you that we've gotten a little bit away from the random sampling survey for two reasons. That first year, we interviewed 600 citizens. And the next thing you could probably guess is everyone said, well, why didn't you ask me? Why did you just ask 600 people? And they didn't really understand that. So what we've done in future years is either we've just done the online survey that anybody can take, or we've done the random sample survey either by phone or mail and the online survey. And I can't emphasize that enough. The online survey is an outlet for everyone to be able to participate. The answers tend to be pretty close to the answers given to the random sample survey, but not always identical because they represent a little bit different audiences. But having that outlet where anyone can voice their opinion is important.
Can they repeatedly
I'm sorry?
go on the online survey? And that's part of the difficulty of online surveys, right? Can they keep going back or go to another computer or?
They could, except that the Public Policy Center is able to account for that. They, now, your IT guy could explain this better than I do, but every computer has a signature, okay? And you're nodding, Alderman. I hope you understand this, so you jump in here if you need to. It has a signature. And if we saw a great number of responses coming from the same signature, we knew that was a problem. For instance, one year we got like 50 from a certain source. Well, we investigated, and what we found out was it was from our public libraries because we'd made a big push to get low-income people involved, and they were using the one source of computers they had with the public library. So when we see evidence of that, usually what we do is we just toss out all the results from that signature.
So just a couple closing comments. I like the three-pronged approach that you guys use. A survey, which we've done a mail survey about 4 years ago, online survey. I know the library did some of that in some of their research, and your deliberate discussion, I think you call it, we've called those citizen summits.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got some experience with some of the major parts, at least from the citizen engagement piece of it. If you could talk for just a second, Rick, I was intrigued earlier to hear you talk a little bit about the interrelationship between crime and pool hours.
Because, there are some folks who will say, well, we just need to cut all parks and rec, but in fact, you see it in a relationship there, I think, as you suggested in Lincoln, where when the pool hours were cut, you maybe saw a spike in youth crime and some other things. And so that's how some of those relationships come into play across departmental lines and budgetary lines as well, right? I mean, there is a cause and effect.
Yes.
So maybe if you just talk a little bit about that.
I will do that, and thank you for asking that question. This kind of originated out of our police chief, who, during the time when people were making their budget decisions a little more politically than necessarily fact-based, finally got fed up because he wasn't getting anything cut, and the rest of the city government was being decimated, and said, look, there's more to it than having officers on the street, guys. My crime rate spikes from 3 to 7 on summer days when you aren't open at the pools. You have to keep that in mind. And just to give you an example of the type of things that we do here, I've highlighted one of our programs. We have community learning centers at a number of our schools, particularly those that are in low-income areas. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is the outcome number. It's in the safety and security outcome, okay? So that got a much higher prioritization as a result of being in the safety and security outcome than it would be if it were just associated with another outcome that traditionally does parks, like healthy and productive people. The point is, that's how these silos break down a little bit. We consider this $80,000 that we're spending to impact the youth crime rate, and that's why that has such a high prioritization number. And the same thing for the pools. We've ranked pools a little higher than we probably normally would because of their impact on youth crime rates.
Alderwoman Stearns, and then Black.
Hi. Yeah, a few just really quick questions. You had about 600 participants, is that right? 600 in a given year? Is that?
Oh, well, it varies depending upon the year, but one year we had 2,700.
Okay.
The low year of that 600 was because we did a random sample survey and limited it to 600.
Just to clarify, so the 600 would have been your sample survey. The others are the several thousand
Correct.
were the
The
online.
2,700 was the online survey where anyone could participate, and it was the year when we were talking about pretty major cuts.
What's the most people, if I could just ask a few simple questions here, what's the most people in a given year that have participated, would you say?
Around 3,000.
3,000? And what is the population of Lincoln?
At the time of the 3,000, it was around 260. We're at about 275 now.
260,000. Okay. And you said you had a couple of city council members that didn't particularly buy in. How many city council members are there?
There are 7.
7?
Mm-hmm.
7? And what was their primary objection or issue? What?
This makes it harder to cut positions. It forces you to cut programs. And programs being cut are not necessarily politically popular. It's a lot easier for all of us to say, okay, I don't think you need that half FTE in parks that's trimming rose bushes, for instance.
Okay. Okay.
When we want to try to get them to talk about programs.
Okay. And finally, in terms of the choices, you framed it mostly, as you said, I think the question is critically important. You framed it mostly in terms of questions to the citizens. Is that right? Like a kind of an either or?
We did an either-or survey one year. The one we've done most recently and the one we adopt now is to give them like 10 programs that each have a cost to them and give them less money than they need to cover all the programs. And then they choose which ones they want to fund.
And what do you do with a citizen who comes up with something that isn't on the list? Something completely different. Well, I really don't want to cut any of this, but I really sure would like to cut administrative cost, or I really sure would like to cut this or that. How do you handle that?
Well, first of all, you don't allow them to do it on that part of the survey, but at every page in the survey, there's a comments box. And actually, that's been really illustrative to us and very helpful over the years.
Okay.
When they fill those kind of ideas in, we've seen a couple of things that have actually worked from that.
Okay. But in general, you just allow them to answer kind of the question as it's written.
Right. It goes back to what I'm saying. You
Okay.
got to be willing to do this if you're going to ask for the input. So if you're asking something that you're not willing to do, you're not increasing public confidence.
Right. But if you're not asking about something, then it's just simply not part of the conversation.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderman Black.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. That may be one of the best PowerPoint presentations I've seen, mostly because you moved along very quickly. You didn't highlight things you've already were in the report, so I like that. What I want to talk about are two things. Number one would be, we've kind of touched on some of the participation from the public and how that is derived. I guess you've talked about a little bit how it's evolved over the years as you've gone through this process. What have you found to be more successful, kind of the random sample mixed with public feedback for participatory reasons, or kind of those, what we call them, the citizen summits, as Alderman Sage alluded to, where you target people, you ask them to participate to try to get that random sample? What have you found to be more effective?
Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of the online surveys to allow people to participate. What we usually do then is try to reach out to various constituent groups across the city, particularly those groups that aren't always necessarily represented. So I don't think that the product you're getting is that much different, and it's more inclusive. Then from that group, we ask all those folks, would you like to participate in a Saturday session, the deliberative discussion, where we look at these issues more fully? And those things are incredibly valuable to staff because you learn details that aren't available to you in a survey. And a survey is kind of a blunt instrument, frankly. But the deliberative discussions allow a lot more color and a lot more detail on what citizens are actually thinking. So they kind of go hand in hand.
Sure, and I read that you had 51 people. It was one Saturday morning that
that was the, I can't remember what year that was. A couple of years we've had over 100. A couple of years
Sure.
we've had less than that. And keep in mind here, if you do this thing, you're giving us 8 hours of your time.
Absolutely.
I can't believe people still do it, but.
Right. That'd be my concern, is that when we ask all that time for people, you tend to target folks that have that kind of availability, those that are working or those that have to worry about taking care of kids. That becomes kind of a challenge, and those are folks that we certainly do want to be engaging. And as we talk about that, it reminds me of when I went to Alderman Stearns and Lauer's forum during the budget cycle, and then Alderman Sage and Schmidt, we did one together. And we saw a lot of faces that we normally don't see, and I think if we're going to go down this path, it would be good to get a lot of new faces and fresh perspectives. It's more of a kind of a council commentary. My second question that I wanted to ask was about flexibility. This process is very methodical, and I like that, but we can't always predict a big blizzard that would come through, or a parking garage that has some challenges, and how does that fit into, if we've promised to deliver on a service, and we have to make the tough choice to, we can't have this, so we've got to take care of this emergency. What is that? You had that experience, or what do you suggest?
We've been fortunate. We've actually kept some money in contingency. We have a kind of a healthy cash reserve. But it goes back to the notion of saying to folks, look, this is the direction we're going, okay? If we don't have enough money, this is what's going away first. This is what's going away second. So they aren't surprised. I think one of the big benefits of this is giving some people some idea of what they can expect when the budget actually is released. Because we typically do this well in advance of the actual release of the mayor's budget, and then use what they've told us then to make the final decisions about what we put forward.
Sure. And I guess one more thing for the council, and thank you for that feedback, would be that for those Tier 0 projects, that we attach the phone number of the representative who is responsible for that mandate. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Alderman.
Let's see, Alderman Fruin, I think, was next, and then Fazzini.
Rick, thank you very much. That was a very good presentation and good materials, and it wasn't overwhelming, so a good chance to look at it ahead of time. The Hoppy name, are you from this area? Or?
No, I'm not. There's more of us than you think. My people are from Nebraska.
There was a family, a very popular family in Normal a few years ago, Hoppy, and so it's an unusual name, but we welcome you anyway.
Thank you, Alderman.
A lot of good potential here. And the first couple things that I see is anytime you can do some business modeling, whatever you want to call this, I think it's very helpful in reaching those decisions. And I say that because we do change city managers, we change mayors, we change council members, and I think sometimes we lose our connectivity because I think our experience would tell us that sometimes council seats don't transfer information when elections happen. So I really see a lack of connectivity sometimes in how information is transferred. I think modeling can bring that. I'm going to make a few comments, and they're not really questions, but maybe comments for my colleagues. But one thing I wrote down here is, do we really have choices? Do we even need a budget process? And I say that because by the time you get the mandates, the pensions, and the roads and the sewers, do you have many choices left over? And I think for what it's worth, sometimes we spend a lot of our time on the smaller cost items. So as a refresher to the council, sometimes we're spending time reacting to some of the cuts or the sacred cows, and then the voice comes out of the community and we put it back into the budget. We have a program called SOAR. It's for handicapped individuals, recreation oriented. We've got a history museum downtown. So those are just a couple examples that if we try to cut 25,000 or 50,000, that's where we spend our time on the smaller cost items. So I think a lot of this, to me, is going to be, as a council, do we have the chemistry among ourselves, and do we have the ability to come together and do things like this? Is this Lincoln form of government, is that a ward-oriented?
We're a strong mayor form of government. Our council has 4 district seats and 3 at-large seats, so it's kind of a hybrid.
That helps because we're a ward system here, and while we think that we all look for the community at large and work together on what's best, we all have different components of the community, whether it's an older neighborhood that's very focused on streets and sewers and so forth, or we got newer neighborhoods that might not have those issues. So we all have some competing priorities that we're hearing from our little contingency or constituents. So I think that's internal, though. I mean, that's not anything to do with your model, but that's the challenge that we're going to have. And I'm glad, I'd like to mention this, and it's really not to you, but to ourselves, I think one of the challenges we have also are election cycles. And we saw that more than ever before in our last election cycle. Sometimes we're not as effective with our decision-making when it's an election cycle. And so I think the business modeling can help that. It's more of a continuous process as opposed to an annual process. So I see that as a real potential. I really like the slide about taking on the sacred cows because there are just so many things in government that we're afraid to touch, and you have to do it, and you can't just continue on forever. So kind of rambling here, but I think discussion is good with us as a group of 10 people up here. And I see a lot of promise in this. The only other comment I'll make is I guess sometimes we're challenged by the misinformation or the lack of information the public has when they're making decisions. And so sometimes I think we have to really find ways that we can re-educate or reconnect or re-educate. And I think that's maybe becoming easier now if we're putting more and more things on the website, we're becoming more transparent. If the public has that information, give them as much as they can to make their decision, then we'll be better off. So I really like your presentation and look forward to further discussion.
Okay. Alderman Fazzini.
What was your bond rating in 2007 and what is it now?
It is AAA right now, and it was teetering on not being AAA when we got there.
Okay, that's what I thought. And I guess question over here. You're starting with Peoria or Bloomington. Why didn't you start with the state of Illinois? I think they need more help than we do.
Well, I'll give you a very honest answer. The state of Illinois is a state of flux right now, and I wanted to wait until after November just before
I see. Okay.
Do something that's possible.
Something that's possible. Okay. I noticed in the write-up that there were 2 areas that caused concern. One of them is the chemistry of the staff might be disrupted, and the other was the time to implement this by our staff would be pretty heavy. How did you overcome those 2, either?
Well, it's a time commitment. What I did is I got the directors together, and we tried to aim for Well, every time a holiday come up, someone knew I was going to call and set a meeting right before that happened because that's when their work was slowest. Okay, right before Christmas, Thanksgiving, 4th of July, there are a couple of days in there that aren't as busy as others. So we tried to schedule meetings when people weren't quite in the middle of something really important. As I was trying to tell the staff, I had my directors working, gosh, a good 10 to 20 hours a month on this for a while, and now it's more in kind of management mode. And once the system's in place, it doesn't take nearly as much maintenance. For instance, we locate our data in our health department. Do you all manage your health department, or is it county?
It's
Okay.
county.
Okay, but we manage ours, but long story short, they had an evaluation unit, and they were really good with data, so we parked it there, and that took a lot of the staff time out of it. As for the chemistry of the staff, it really does take a leader to step forward and get people to come together and understand that this is a better way of doing business. I mean, one of the great things that was said to me is our director of urban development, after he was kind of a skeptic and took me aside and said, you know, the great thing about this is someone's finally made it okay for us to let go of something. We can actually cut stuff now and have rationale for doing it, or we can have rationale for asking for more money. And he never really felt like that in his time in government, that he'd had that kind of support. So that chemistry can be there with the right leadership, I believe.
So your goal to be the best like official in the government before each holiday, that's working for you?
Yes, as chief of staff, no, I'm not well liked, though, I must tell you.
Thank you.
Actually, just one, as long as I have both of you up there, just to clear before I move on to the last few council members. In terms just of the methodology, so you started out with a survey of about 600, and that was the random, probably stratified survey by voting precincts and whatever throughout your city. And was that the constant, roughly 600? I mean, other than, I don't mean, apart from the focus groups, apart from the online, when you went back to
the
till,
number of people we've used has depended in large part on the cost of the survey. Obviously, it's more expensive to do a 600-person survey than a 500-person.
Sure.
So it's bounced back and forth between 400 and 600, kind of depending upon the funds we had at that particular time.
And you've not had noise in that data, I'm assuming.
I'm sorry?
You haven't had that much noise in the data with the validity checks of where people come from and males and females and demographics. I mean, 400 to 600, you don't have
a random sample survey is supposed to account for all of that,
Yeah.
so that shouldn't be an issue. In other words, they should approximate what your city's composition is.
Right. And then so you combine that with larger numbers that are online. Of course, the online information tells you something different. You don't have as accurate a point estimate as you will with the 400 to 600. So your 2,700, 2,800 isn't going to be as accurate as your 400 to 600 in terms of a point estimate, but you're getting more ideas and more thoughts and more opportunities for people to comment.
Yes, Mayor, I think that's a pretty good summary of it, yes.
And then you also have the focus groups to provide you with even more clarification.
Correct.
Right. And just to clarify, we're talking about, numbers, and the number of people in the population is really irrelevant. I mean, a 400 to 600 survey is going to give you the same level of accuracy in Bloomington, the entire state of Illinois, the entire country, or the entire planet if it's done right. Right. It doesn't really, the size of the population is minimal compared to that.
Well,
right?
I think you try to get the percentage of the population.
Right,
And
but in terms of if I'm generalizing to China, I say China because they have 1.5 billion people, right? A survey of 400 is going to give me almost no better accuracy in generalizing to Bloomington than it would be to generalize to China, right?
Yeah. On the survey point, thinking ahead, I think that the best thing to do today in 2014, let me back up just a bit. 30 years ago, when I first studied survey research as a graduate student, phone surveys were the gold standard. They were simply the best. With cell phones and what's happened lately, cell phones or phone surveys are not the best. The gold standard today are mail-out surveys, and I've talked about this with our survey research people, and I think that properly done, if I sent out 9,000 surveys and got 3,000 back, that's pretty good. And
Is that possible? I've never heard of that.
I think it is possible. If it's advertised in the correct way, if it's in the paper, if it's on the television, if it's on radio, and people are anticipating this, and they're told that they can participate. This is, I think you can do that. I think you get a 30%. If I send I say 9,000. If I send 10,000, send 12,000. But if I get 3,000 back, that's a good survey, and that's a good base to use that survey to start the start the discussion going, then go on to the group sessions, and then do an online survey, do the website, and compare.
Okay, great. Let's see, in terms of the order that I have, I believe I had Alderman Milwambwe and Painter, Sage, and Schmidt in that order. Baboka?
Okay, thank you. Really enjoyed the presentation as well and reading the materials. I guess similar to my friend Jim Fruin here, I have a little bit of concern. I like the ideas in theory. My initial concern is with the continuity of councils, something that we've seen where things can kind of get changed when you have an election and you have a new council. So people don't necessarily abide by the ideas that were shared or agreed to in the past. So I would be, and I guess that's a question for all of us, is to think about how do we impose the discipline on the whole body to continue with what's been started 3-4 years before. And I don't expect you to answer that, but that's just a comment that I wanted to make. It's something that we need to do together. The other thing that I also noticed that's a little bit, that could be a little bit different, because I'm always careful to not apply what worked in one community to another, because I know some of the variables can be different. For example, the trust factor is another one. You know, we've had different events here in Bloomington that I think, in my opinion, such as the Coliseum, that seems to be coming up every year, every single year, and that affects the trust that people have in city government. And I don't know if the city of Lincoln has experienced something similar or as traumatic, where you know, people would not be inclined to trust them initially. At least the way you've described the process, it seemed like you know, some of your ideas were not necessarily readily accepted, but did not encounter as much resistance initially. Is that correct?
I think the trust will come from the methodology and the transparency of the process. I mean, this is it. And this is how the surveys are conducted. This is how the decisions were made. This is how the algorithm for scoring programs came about. We don't make it so esoteric that no one understands it. Make it very simple and very open. A gentleman that can't be here tonight, or could not be here tonight, is a fellow that will probably do some consulting on this project with me, and he's an alderman in the city of Chicago. And he has talked about this very process in Europe, in cities in Europe. Just got back from Paris talking about it. He's been all over the United States talking about it. He does it in his ward, and his name is Joe Moore. He's in the 49th ward of the city of Chicago. Joe told me at lunch last Tuesday that he had 1,700 people from his ward at a meeting, at a discussion. That is phenomenal. That is phenomenal. He has a very diverse ward, so the makeup is a little bit of everything in Joe's ward. And I said, do you want to work on this project? He said, yeah. So he would have been here. He's in Wisconsin. So, but I just wanted to tell you that. And he stresses that transparency. And that's what we have to do. We have to be precise in what we do. Our methodology has got to be beyond reproach. And we have to open it up to everybody. I like to talk this is liberal democracy on steroids. You know. Now, you're right. The final decisions are right there.
Okay, good. One more, if I may. So I know in higher education there's this process called performance-based funding, but at least as far as I understand it, it's more of a gradual approach where you're not necessarily taking away all the funds right away, but you are allocating a percentage of the funds to areas that perform a little bit better. So is there room for that in this process?
I think that can be discussed later on. I mean, I don't know, I'd say there's no room for it. Of course there's room. And it would be a decision that the council would have to make when you come down to making final budget decisions.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, move on to Alderwoman Painter, Sage, and Schmidt, and then we will wrap up.
Well, thank you. That was a great presentation. If we try and implement this, I would like it to succeed rather than fail. And you have mentioned that there were several municipalities that attempted this and they failed. Could you expound on that a bit and tell me why you were different other than strong leadership? What led to your success and what led to their failure?
I can tell you my experience in the last 3 weeks, and that's about how long it's been. I looked at something called priority budgeting, which the Financial Officers Association in Chicago has developed an article on it, almost a booklet. I think you have that. And I think, Rick, were you you weren't part of developing that, so I called up some of the cities, and I said, you're in the article, you know. How did you do? And they didn't want to talk about it. They did it for 1 year, and they changed mayors, and they changed aldermen, and they threw it out, and it cost them $200,000. They paid for it. And I talked to Savannah, Georgia, and they was the same thing. They do a little bit of it now, but they don't. And I looked at Lincoln, Nebraska, and I compared the two. And one of the things that jumped out at me at the Lincoln model, if I can call it that, is that it's not as complex and as heavy as the priority budgeting, and it doesn't allow for as much political bickering, if you will, as the priority budgeting. And that made me very much aware that there is a system here that can be worked out. We're going to call it the Bloomington model when we're done, because it won't be exactly like Lincoln's. Yeah. It'll be pretty much geared towards what your needs are. And so I think a lot of lessons can be learned from Cincinnati and from Savannah, Georgia, and some of the others. And the people that promoted this are in business. They're two entrepreneurs in Colorado, and there's still municipalities that say they'll sell this to. But I wanted something that worked. So I think I want to say this. In priority budgeting, there are some excellent ideas. It's just too complicated. It's just too complicated, like developing an airplane that's, you know.
Yeah.
All right, it won't fly. So we need something that'll fly, and that's what I think. That's my experience in the last, not exhaustive. I didn't do any studies of each one, but my instincts tell me that's the problem. It was just too much of all these. I mean, I couldn't understand it, frankly, you know. So.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Excuse me. Alderman Sage and then Schmidt.
Yeah, start by saying again to Bernie and Rick, thanks again for being here. We know you have full schedules, and we appreciate your willingness to help here. And I want to acknowledge Mboka and Jim's comments, because if Bernie's heard me say this once, he's heard me say it a dozen times, and that is, at the end of the day, we have to have a repeatable process that can be used regardless of whoever's sitting around this platform. Alderman, mayor, city manager, whoever. And so, you know, I appreciate that, I guess the echoing of that, Jim, because you're right. I mean, this needs to be something that is independent of the personalities on the console right now. And if that's not a key performance indicator for us on this project, hopefully, then it probably needs to be. The other thing is this idea of I kind of like to, at times, as much as possible, start with the end in mind. That's a Stephen Covey principle thing. And one of the things in the article that I really liked, the GFOA article that you referenced, Bernie, was, and this just sums it up nicely for me, and this is what I hope a place where we can get to. A set of priorities expressed in terms of measurable results that are of value to citizens and widely agreed to be legitimate by elected officials, staff, and the public. I mean, and I looked at so much of what Rick shared with us in terms of of priorities, measurable results, seen by of value by the citizens and perceived, widely agreed to. It's just, there's nothing we're ever going to do here that's going to be unanimous, whether it's on the city council or even across the city, right? But I do like this idea that are widely agreed to be legitimate by elected officials, staff, and the public. And so that's where I feel like I hope we can get to at the end of this is a repeatable process that is independent of that will work regardless of who's sitting around the platform up here. So again, gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Again, moving on to Alderwoman, Schmidt.
I had a
Screll.
question, Rick, about Lincoln, and I can't really think of a real diplomatic way to ask this, so I'm just going to ask it.
Well, it'd be like being in front of my city council. Fantastic.
How do you assure that the staff ideas that are put out there include all of your sacred cows? I mean, how do you kind of police yourself and make sure you're constantly asking yourself, am I putting everything out on the table, or am I kind of, preferencing something? I'm going to make that a tier 1, by God.
That's an excellent question. And let me just say it equally plain. Politics still plays a role, okay? Lincoln Arts Council. This probably should, if we had followed this strictly, probably would have went away some time ago. But it is a program that matters a great deal to the mayor. And he said, I understand it's a low priority, but here's what I think it does. Here's how I think it meets our performance indicators. I'd like it to continue to support it. So there is going to be an element of that. I mean, there's just no getting around that you're not always going to slavishly devote yourself to this. It's a guideline and a framework. It isn't a Bible, I guess is the best way I can put it.
And I just would want to offer an observation. I think this is a really interesting process. I would be uncomfortable with one that completely emulates what Lincoln does, because I think if the council's not involved, then it is an abdication of our responsibilities as well. But it looks like 3 legs on a stool. We've got the citizens, the staff, and the council together in a different configuration, and I like that.
Thank you. And I think Alderwoman Stearns.
Thank
and
you.
then very
Just
final
real
thoughts.
quick, and actually, Alderwoman Schmidt kind of covered what I was going to say, and thank you for answering that. Indeed, there are some, political, things that could happen. And my question was similar in that you said, we don't ask for input on something that we're not willing to do. And that makes sense. But my question is kind of, well, who decides what we're willing to do or we're not willing to do? And that has got to be kind of a political process. I mean, similar to what?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other last words, comments on this? I think we've got a framework. It's just certainly something that we're going to be discussing as a council. I think certainly very much appreciate David as well as Bernie and Rick. Thank you so much, for coming. And you've certainly given us a lot to think about, and the staff a lot to think about as we move forward. And we certainly appreciate your time and tireless energy, and certainly coming the longest distance from Lincoln. And Lincoln has a little over 200,000 people now, is that right?
About 270.
270, oh wow. You've grown considerably then.
Grown considerably the last few years, yes.
Okay, all right, good. Well, thank you very much. And I do just want to remind everyone that this evening, or notify everyone, that there is the Not in Our Town people in Bloomington are holding an event at 7 o'clock right by the old courthouse in remembrance of the, basically participation reminder of the Ferguson, Missouri situation, but that we know that in Bloomington, it's not going to happen in our town. And so I just remind you of that. If you didn't know, it's starting at 7 o'clock this evening. Anyone else? We don't technically have this down here, but Alderman Bruin, did you have something else
Just
to say
a
before?
quick thing with the return to school. I think there's a couple Promise Council activities in the morning at different schools. I think Bloomington Junior High School and Evans and maybe some others, so Sheridan. So just one more of those community activities. Are always looking for our representation there, and we all have schedules and busy things, but just a reminder that's in the morning.
Right. Well, thank you. Actually, this morning I gave the kind of a welcome as mayor and talked about some of the things that we're doing here in Bloomington with downtown development and how that might just affect District 87 to the returning and new District 87 teachers. it was the first time I did it because last year I was doing freshman advising and I was obligated first thing in the morning at Illinois Wesleyan, so I realized that this was a new event. But it was actually a very interesting talk with obviously school board president Mike Harrison and Barry Riley, and got kind of an idea of what's going on in some of the nearly 40 new teachers that are going through. And so anyway, thank you all. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Moved by Alderwoman Stearns and someone else that was jolly on the spot. Second by Alderwoman Miller-Wamboy. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Again, we're adjourned. Thank you.